So I just made it to North Utica, Illinois, and just parked at this hiking trail. We're gonna hike down to this kind of canyon area, and we're gonna walk and talk to you guys about the Starved Rock murders. 3 women were murdered at the end of the hiking trail. So we're gonna talk to you guys about the events of what happened and show you guys what I believe is where they were actually murdered at. Should be at the end of the trail. So let's get into it. Now, on Monday, March 14th, 1960, 3 friends named Mildred Lindquist, who was 50, Frances Murphy, who was 47, and Lillian Oding, who was also 50, all went to Starved Rock Park, which is pretty close to Utica, Illinois, and they went there for a 4-day vacation to go and, of course, explore the area, do some hiking, etc. Unfortunately, all 3 of them would never make it out of that park alive. Now, after they arrived on Monday, they all decided to go get some lunch and then decided to go hike the beautiful canyon that, of course, is kind of the main attraction that is Starved Rock Park. Now, the 3 friends started on their hike away from the lodge. Now, at this time of year, there was a little bit of snow on the ground, and so they, of course, were wearing their rubber boots to, of course, keep their feet from getting wet. They've brought along their camera and binoculars so they could take pictures of each other and the scenery, and, of course, use the binoculars to see any wildlife that would be in the area. Now, their goal was to have come to the St. Louis Canyon, which at the end usually has a nice, beautiful waterfall. In March, it was frozen, but nonetheless, still a very beautiful hike. Now, one of the first signs that something was wrong happened that Monday evening when George Oding, who again was Lillian's husband, he tried to telephone his wife at the lodge, as she promised she would call him during the day, and she of course did not. So he called the lodge, but he was told by the staff that his wife was simply not available, and George probably just assumed that all 3 of the ladies went out to go get food or, continue on their hike. And so he didn't really think much of it. So he decided to call the next day, which would be Tuesday. And once again, another employee told him on Tuesday that he thought he saw all 3 of them eating breakfast in the lodge. And so George, of course, was fine with that answer. And so he ended up hanging up the phone call. Unfortunately, the employee saw 3 other women that were not the ones that were killed. Now, Tuesday night, a winter storm hit the valley and ended up covering not only the footprints and bloodstains, but of course, any other DNA and evidence that happened to be in the open air was covered by the snow. Now, on Wednesday, George again telephoned the lodge, but he was finally told that his wife Lillian and her 2 friends could not be located. And finally, the employees decided to go to the 2 rooms that the women had rented and found that all of their bags and beds were untouched. which again would be very unusual if they had been there for 3 days at that point. The beds would be, disheveled, and bags would be opened, with their clothes and everything. So obviously they were getting quite concerned. At this point, the women had been missing for about 40 hours or so. Now, as soon as George found out all this information, he immediately telephoned his friend who is in the Chicago Crime Commission. His friend's name was Virgil Peterson. Now, when Peterson heard of this, he immediately called the state police and local law enforcement to arrive in the area. Now, one of the local newspaper reporters named Bill Danley heard of the missing women and decided to head there himself. He ended up grabbing his camera, and in the parking lot, he ran into a young boy, and the young boy told him that some bodies had been found on one of the trails. And so these pictures that you see popping up on screen, some of these pictures, if not all of them, were taken by Bill Danley, the newspaper reporter. When the police and Bill Danley arrived to find the bodies, they discovered that all 3 women were mutilated and were laying side by side. They were on their backs underneath a small ledge, and their pants had been torn away, as well as their legs spread open, which again kind of leads the police at that time to believe that maybe these women had been assaulted before their untimely deaths. Some of the evidence that they did find that didn't get destroyed by the snow, of course, was some heavy white twine that had been tied around 2 of the bodies and one of the women's heads. Now, keep this in mind, as that twine would be crucial to the evidence later in this story. Now, Frances Murphy's camera was found about 10 feet away or so from where all 3 women's bodies were found. Its leather case was smeared in blood, and the strap was broken. And they also found the bloody binoculars that they had brought with them. They also found a frozen tree limb that was also streaked with blood, determined at that point that the most likely murder weapon was in fact this frozen tree limb. And so they believed that all 3 women were clubbed by this tree limb. Now, the police also believed that whoever the killer was probably killed them deeper in the canyon and ended up dragging their bodies up underneath the rock ledge. They, of course, were not really sure why the killer would have done that, but they determined that that was most likely what happened. Because of how cold it was and the snow, the medical team doing the autopsy failed to find any evidence of sexual assault on any of the 3 women. Because of the conditions that the bodies were in, it was hard to tell. And all of their money and jewelry were left behind in their rooms, and nothing else was taken from their bodies. And so the police simply had no real motive as of why these women would be killed in the first place. And so this is where their long investigation starts. Now, the state's attorney, whose name was Warren, he was kind of the main person to start looking into the case. He was kind of forced into this investigation as the state authorities at the time didn't really have any experience dealing with murders of this magnitude. And so the state attorney, Warren, he kind of simply became the guy in charge because of that. 2 deputies ended up helping Warren with this investigation, and they all started investigating the twine that was found, as of course this was the main DNA evidence. This particular twine was also used in the lodge's kitchen, and they found that the lodge had purchased this twine some time ago, and it was the same twine that was used in the murders. And so they believed that their killer either worked at the lodge or, of course, had access to the lodge in some manner. They did polygraph tests of all the lodge employees, but all of them had passed. They finally brought in one of the former dishwashers named Chester Otto Wedger. Wedger was 21 years old at the time, and he used to work at the lodge during the same time frame when the women were murdered. He took his polygraph test, and after he took the test, the technician said, "I believe that's your man." He was already married and had 2 young children, and he worked at the lodge up until that summer when he decided to resign to go into business with his father. Chester ended up surrendering one of his jackets that had some suspicious quote-unquote dark stains on it. Now, he was given more tests and ended up failing each one, and so of course the police were very sure that Chester was their guy. They even put Chester under some surveillance to see if they could catch him doing anything to incriminate himself. Now, the police found that there was a reported robbery and sexual assault that took place about a mile from Starved Rock, about a year or so before the murders. And when the police talked to the victim, she saw a picture of Chester and said, "Yes, that was the guy who tried to rob me and sexually assault me." So with that information, they decided to arrest Chester for that attempted sexual assault and robbery. They, of course, wanted to arrest him for those things in order to at least get him in custody. That way they could build up any more evidence against him for the 3 murders. The 2 deputies interrogated Chester throughout the whole night, and finally, after midnight, they kept pressuring him and asking him about not only the sexual assault of the other lady a year prior, but they finally started asking him about the murders. Now, he finally stopped them and said he would like to see his family, and so a police car showed up to his parents' home, and his mother and father were brought to the courthouse so they could finally talk to each other. The next day, one of the deputies ended up talking to Chester and said, "Chester, why don't you tell me about it? There are just 2 of us here, so just tell us." So finally, Chester said, "All right, I did it. I got scared. I tried to grab their pocketbook, and they fought, and so I hit them." Now, Chester was referring to the camera and not the actual pocketbook. Chester's confession was written down and signed by Chester. He described dragging the bodies underneath the overhang and that he saw a small airplane flying low overhead. And so that's why he said he moved the bodies to underneath the ledge. And over the next few days, Chester still talked to the police and told them more information that they were wanting to hear. However, as soon as he got to court with his attorney, he changed his story and said that he was innocent of all charges. And he continued to say that both of the deputies had coerced him into a confession by threatening him with a gun. And so he said he lied about his multiple confessions because he was scared, and so he signed the papers anyway. Now, when Chester was finally brought to trial, it was about 10 months later, in January 1961, they decided to only charge Chester with one of the 3 murders, as they believed that if they tried to charge him with all 3 murders, that it may go to a mistrial or an acquittal, and so they decided to only charge him with one of the murders. And so on March 4th, 1961, nearly 1 year later after the murders, the jury brought back a guilty verdict for Chester. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, that life sentence in Illinois at the time meant that he would be eligible for parole. November of 2019, after 24 times, Chester was finally granted parole and has since been released to a halfway house. Again, I don't know what he's up to at this point, as that was 4 years ago or so, but he is out of prison now. Again, many people claiming he is innocent, including himself. Anyway, guys, a very, very sad but interesting case. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below, if you think he's innocent or guilty. Again, I appreciate you guys being patient with my upload schedule. We're getting back on track next week, so I'll see you next week. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you soon.